Zoom, they're doing my head in. Over to you, Christophe.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining again. Interesting topic tonight, soil sampling. Let me tell you that you'll see this is probably one of the most complicated things that the regulator has ever invented, for good reasons. Let me share my screen for the presentation and we'll be off. All right. As usual, please interrupt if you have any questions, etc., etc., etc. Yes, I just wanted to, yesterday when we were talking full cam, we should have done quickly, I didn't think about it, apologies for that. We should have done quickly a little bit of a fire event just to show you what it looks like. So I thought I'd show you a bit of a, remember those output curves from full cam? That's what they look like when you create a fire event. The one on the left, of course, is one single fire event in the middle. And the other one is the one that is the baseline modeling for an avoided clearing project where you have those repetitive cycle of clearing. Here you go. So you will see that in neither of those cases you can see too much of the impact of fire. Despite it's a fire, because none of those imply a lot of loss of mass, of biomass actually. So there's debris from some of the dead trees and falling limbs, etc. But there's not a lot of impact of methane and nitrous dioxide. All right, so sampling. We'll cover quickly what is the order of things to organize and orchestrate a soil sampling, which is pretty precise. We'll talk about the sampling plan, which is a document that you need to send to the CER when you're about to do a sampling round. We'll talk about stratification, extremely important, probably the second most important thing apart from rainfall and moisture that can influence the results of your soil carbon project. Then having a quick look at how do you actually calculate the soil carbon content once you've done it from the results of your sample, and then talk about all the requirements for the soil sampling, just a collection of things you need to know. There are two excellent documents that are mentioned at the bottom of the page there, related that directly list all the requirements in great detail about what you need to do for sampling. So the sampling guidance form is a measurement-based soil carbon method is a detailed one, is a techie one, but goes to all the details, and understanding your soil carbon projects will give you a good idea of what to do for sampling at a high level, right? And let's go. So this is the process. What to do to, sorry, I'm moving things around on the screen. What to do to organize sampling. Now, the reason why we're talking about sampling in a week dedicated to registration is that since the 21 method, you can actually do your baseline sampling in parallel with the registration of the project. You can start your baseline sampling as soon as you have submitted your project for registration. You don't have to wait until it's declared. Don't do it before you press the submit button. But after that, you can go ahead. Saves a lot of time because you don't have to wait until your project is declared and then organize the sampling, which take an awfully long time. So I always there's a tick in the box in the application form that says, do you wish to conduct your baseline sampling during the registration of the project? I always tick that box, right, which is a second step there on the page. Tick the sampling box. Then you have to submit your application, can't do it before. Then you have to prepare your sampling plan, which is the document that informs the CER of all the technical details of your how you organize your sampling to the most important thing in the sampling plan is stratification. We'll talk about that a bit later. So stratification important. So you start stratify your project. To submit the application, remember that you only have to send a map of the CEA. You don't have to send the strata at the time of the application. Now you prepare your sampling plan. You understand how many samples you're going to do, how many stratas you're going to have, or the depth of your sampling, etc., etc. Then you stratify. Then you send your sampling plan to the CER, which includes a map of the strata. Then you need the samples need to be randomly generated, right? So, and the CER wants you to use a certified method to generate those random location, right? The most simple way to do that is to use a method that they themselves suggest, is that you use as a seed, you use a verified random number generator based on a seed that you have to choose a seed that is verifiable and repeatable, right? So that if you put the same seed, you'll get the same results. So there's one process which is very common, is that you use the date. When you send your sampling plan to the CER, they have a special mailbox that sends you back an email, and you use as a seed for your random number generated the date and time to the second when the CER sent you back that email, plus a random offset that they specify in the email. So for example, if they send their email at 12:30, 12:37 and 51 second, they say, oh, use an email of 30, an offset of 30 minutes, you'd use 1:07:51 seconds as a random seed. Okay, use that to generate the random points. You have to send the sampling points that you generated to the CER, and after that you can actually do the sampling. There need to be a clear and auditable chain of custody between the moment that you send the sampling points to sampler, when the sampling is done, when the samples are sent to the lab and processed for results. The purpose of that is obviously to avoid that you sample and then you substitute samples for much better ones, and that's what you use for results. So you need to be able to prove that they are the same samples that went from when the sampler took them to the lab. People like FarmLab, for example, will give you barcodes that correspond to with an identification number that corresponds to the sample point that they've generated, that you can use to prove that it's been the same core that's been sent to the lab.
Christophe, I'm going to interrupt for a second before we move on. Some people in the chat are interested in the concept of a seed and may not have heard that. And it's a biological seed versus a mathematical seed, and how that generator.
Yeah, sorry. Every random number generated start with something and a number, and applies a very complex fudging algorithm, so to speak, to come up to a number. That original number that is used to start the random number generator is called a seed, right? So if you give it, there's no real random number generator in existence. In computers, there are some nature-based random number generators where you have a random natural process, and the random number generator is based on measuring, for example, the impact of a radiation from a radioactive sample that generates random noise. But most of the, sorry, all of the computer-generated algorithm use a seed and then use a complex algorithm to just spit random numbers, but they're actually pseudo-random numbers, because if you give them one seed, they always give you the same result, right? So the randomness actually comes from the seed, not from the algorithm. So that is yeah, that's what the seed is. It's a number that you give to the random number generator, so that the CER can verify that you've actually used a very certified process, because they themselves can replicate that. If they gave the same seed, they'll get the same number. So it's completely auditable the way you've done that. There are a number of people who actually provide those numbers, those random number generators. If you give them the seed, they'll give you a set of random numbers that correspond to that. I told you that the CER had invented something nicely complicated. No, it's actually fair enough. It's actually a really good process. It's a bit complex, but it's a good process.
And Mike, I'm going to come off and talk to your question there, because I think you get, ask your question, Christophe.
Yeah, so Christophe, my understanding is, even with the seed thing being randomly generated, who actually drops the point? Because it's not the proponent that actually drops the sampling points. So how do the sampling points go from this seed to a geolocated point on your property?
You have, as I said, there's a number of people who can do that. Most of the GIS systems actually can do that for you. You give them a seed and they actually generate random points, random geographic points. The best one, and the one that I personally use, is FarmLab. FarmLab, they have a online process. You give them a seed. You give them, of course, you need the stratum. You say, I want 3 samples in this stratum, 10 samples in this one, and 12 in this one. You give them the seed, and they generate the points for you. And there's a number of others that can do that. So it's not something you can do yourself. You have to use specific providers to do that. And most GIS systems have actually that capability. I personally use FarmLab precisely because of the chain of custody as well. They give you unique identifiers for the sampling points that you can stick on your, give to the sampler to stick on the core, and therefore that goes their way all to the lab, and the lab then refers to the results with that same identifier. So you have a chain of, you have traceability all through the chain, right? But you can use other suppliers. Okay. So you conduct your sampling. Before, my diagram is a bit actually misleading. No, sorry. After the sampling has been conducted, for some practical reason, sometimes you cannot actually sample in the exact place that the sampling point was dropped. So you have to, once the sampling is finished, send back to the CER the actual sampling locations attached to the same sampling plane. So you send the sampling plane, they send you the seed back. You send them back the planned sampling location. You conduct the sampling, you send them back the actual sampling location, and need to keep a trace of that for audit, of course. All right. Then you send the samples to the lab. You receive the results, and you can finally estimate your soil carbon in your project. Yes, so that you know exactly where you stand for your baseline sampling. Same process for subsequent sampling rounds, except that your sampling plan need to take into account, for example, the depth that you've sampled in the baseline sampling round must be the same in most circumstances than your baseline sampling round. Okay. So that orchestration is to be precise, because you can't, if you miss one step, your sampling run is not eligible and it's costly. So make sure that you do it, you follow exactly the steps. And there are quite a number of traps in there. For example, one thing, if you extract the seed for the number, if you use the CER suggested method of the of using the date and time that says send the email back, you need to be able to extract from an email the exact date to the second where they sent it back, when they sent it back. Sorry, I've lost my mouse. All right. The sampling plan. The sampling plan is, I've got the two official documents there that actually define the requirements on the sampling plan. As I said, it needs to include the map of your strata. There needs to be at least 3 strata per CEA or more, but at least 3. You need to describe the process for randomly assigning the sampling location, minimum 3 location per strata, which means that minimum 9 of sampling locations per CEA. So you need to describe, for example, as simply as, you know, I'm going to use a FarmLab sampling generator, and you know the FarmLab can give you a description of the technical details of the sampling generator, and how you're going to composite sample. Compositing sample refers to if you're going to use one sample as a physical sample that you take off the ground, or whether you're going to take several samples and mix them up to make one sample sent to the lab. There are restrictions on how you can composite samples. The objective of doing that is to reduce the variance of your sampling. The downside of that, if you composite, of course, is that you have to have more samples to be able to composite them into one sample. So it reduces your variance, and we'll see that it's important, but you need to have more samples for that, right? You also need to describe what is the process that you're going to use if the sample, there's an obstacle that prevents the sampling at the planned location, whether it's a rock, whether it's a tree, whether it's a pond, whether it's whatever you didn't plan. You need to describe exactly, very precisely what you're going to do. The CER themselves suggests one process, which is, you move north 10 meters, and if that still is not sampled, you turn 10 degrees to the east and you move X meters, etc., until you find a sampleable location. Or you can use reserve points, which you need to include in your sampling plan. If one point is not usable, you use one of the reserve points, right? You need to describe all that process in your plan. You need to describe if the strata are of the same size or not, because if the strata are of the same size, you can composite samples across the strata to reduce the variance again, but only if they are of the same size, which I don't understand why you would use strata of the same size. You'll see why, but maybe some cases you can do that. It's beneficial to do that. And as I said, the nominated depth. The nominated depth is the depths at which you intend to sample. It's a minimum of 30 centimeters and a maximum of 1 meter. It's not necessarily the depths that you want to include as the depths of your evaluation of soil carbon. You can choose to sample to 1 meter and still use only the estimate of carbon in the 0 to 30 centimeter layer. The minimum that you need to include in your estimation is 0 to 30 centimeters, but you can optionally use to include the 30 centimeter to 1 meter or any depth in between in your sampling estimates. The difference is basically that you the layer below 30 centimeters is usually lower in soil carbon because it's not as rich in organic material, but so it'll dampen your results, but it also varies more slowly, so it'll reduce the variation over time and the impact of the difference in moisture, etc. So it'll buffer the variation of your soil carbon over time. So your results are probably going to be lower. They're going to be very more slowly, but they'll be more resistant to variation in soil moisture, for example. Okay. That's it. So that's a sampling plan. Very important document, and very importantly, you cannot submit it twice. The obvious reason is that when you get that seed back, they don't want what the CI wants to avoid is you send a sampling point, you do the seeds, you get the sampling points, and you see, oh no, they're not good enough. You know, they're near rocks, or they're too much on the ridges. I want more samples on the flats. You resend the plan until you get favorable points. So no can do. You can actually do it, but you have to have exceptional circumstances and justify that to the CI why you did that. You know, the dog ate the sampler or something like that. Otherwise, no, only one sampling plan. So make sure that it's ready. And you need to know, as I said, to be able to extract the original time in Canberra time. So if you're in a different time zone, like, you know, poor Queenslanders, for example, you need to extract it in Canberra time. In Gmail, it's three little dots on a thing, and then there's a little bracket show original that gives you all the gory technical details on the email, including the original time that it's sent. Stratification. As I said, that is probably the most important, second most important thing that can influence the results of your soil carbon. Why? Because, as you'll see, I think I've got it in the next slide. Yeah. The estimation of the soil carbon is discounted based on the variance of the soil samples, right? So you must ensure that your strata are as consistent as possible in their soil content. Let me give you an example of the reason why the CR does that. If you have two equal size strata, you do 5 samples in one, and you get all your 5 results, you know, between 4 tons of carbon per hectare and 4.01. So all your 5 results are smack bang into that between very close to 4. You can pretty much assume that the average of those 4 samples, i.e. 4, is your soil carbon content. Now, if you have different stratum that is not as consistent, and your 5 samples give results between 1 and 7, the average is still 4, but your confidence that you might have got it wrong because your sample are a lot more dispersed is less. So you're not as sure that your mean is actually representative of your true carbon content, because there's so much dispersion. You might just have the samples that end up with an average of 4, whereas the true average is 4.5. And therefore, if your samples are really dispersed like that, the CR estimates that the mean is probably not representative. And therefore, just to protect themselves from, in case that average was actually exceeding the real average, they discount that. So they specify that mathematically your sampling must meet a certain probability of exceedance, so that they're certain that the true result is actually exceeding the calculated results. So your stratification is pretty important. What you've got on the screen is 2 stratification examples that I've given you. They're based on height. Those two ones are based on height and wetness index. A lot of them are based on the NVDI, which stands for, somebody help me, NVDI, something vegetation index, which calculates the greenness of the vegetation. Wardy, do you know?
Yeah, well, National Directory of Vegetation Index or something like that. But the stratification, there's some questions still coming through. So as an agronomist, an advisor, or as a farmer, as a self-proponent, how should I be selecting my stratification, and what's the optimum number of stratas? Is it better to have more samples in fewer stratas, 3 samples a minimum across every strata? What's the maths behind this lever, or are you about to cover that?
Good question. Roughly, I was about to cover that, but the answer is whatever minimizes your variance. So it's not so much the number of samples that matters, it's the consistency between the samples, right? So you don't have to have a huge number of samples. As long as you pick a strata to have those samples, that is really consistent. But of course, because of the requirements to have a minimum of 3 samples per stratum, if you have a lot of them to make them consistent, you will have a lot of samples. So you need to strike the balance between the consistency and therefore the size of your strata and the number of samples, because you can't afford to sample too much. But there's no magic number. Well, I use a magic number, so there is a magic number, but it's there's no magic number. It's usually you don't want a CEA which is bigger than 200 hectares, because if you divide that, that forces you to divide them in more stratum, and therefore it's going to be costly. But you can have very large CEAs if the soil is very consistent, right? So usually pick a CEA 300 to 500 hectares, divide that in 6 stratum, and have 3 samples per stratum. I use as a rough guide to estimate costs upfront like that. When the only thing you know is the size of the CEA is 1 sample for 20 hectares. But that is just like finger in the air just to know roughly what I'm looking at, right? After that, the hard yards start in terms of defining exactly your sampling plan, your stratification, and your number of samples.
Thank you. Hey, Mel, I know you were at Carbon Link as well, and we've been chatting in the direct messages. Do you want to share some of your experience there as well?
Yeah, so the team that I had, there was a GIS team, and they spent a lot of time getting their stratification done really thoroughly and really well. And then my job was to, I did a data analysis on the optimum number of cores per strata. And also, so there's a sweet point where if you sample more cores, it's going to cost you more dollars, but your variance is lower. So, okay, I don't know if Carbon Link would, this is their IP or not, but I don't work there anymore. So the number was about 10 or 12 cores per strata, but that was based on the price of carbon being around $37 per ton. So basically like 10 to 12 cores per strata gave you the optimal number of profit from your accus, but that might mean that you might have to sample more, and going out and sampling more might cost you more. So it's spend more money to get more accus.
Thank you.
I've heard. Thank you, Mel. That's exactly the practical experience. I think FarmLab has published a paper where they say that the minimum optimal number is 6, so they'd never have any less than 6 samples, I think, per stratum. But it was more towards that's a minimum where you start to have a variance that is good enough. It wasn't the optimal.
Yeah.
Just to show you to answer your question, Morty, it's just like it's a complicated thing, but very important to get right. So you got a number of other CSP like Carbon Leak or whomever can help you do that stratification. But pick one who knows how to do a stratification really well, or you can do it yourself using FarmLab. I'm not sure whether Seaboard Labs have stratification tools or not. Anyway, so two examples of stratification on the screen, just to show you the difference in variance depending on what sort of terrain and vegetation your property is. You can see that the one on the left, which I think is stratified using NDVI and height, elevation. You can see that the strata follow more or less the contour of the terrain, with except of little pockets there. And the one on the right is a very, very flat and you see that it's been cultivated. It's an ex-peanut farm, I think, that's been turned into pasture. And you can see that how consistent already the CEA is, because it's been toiled and tilled and managed in the past. It's already very consistent. So that is a really good case. You're pretty sure that your stratification is when you see that, you've got a good stratification, right? So you need to try different things. You need to try different indicators until you're comfortable that all the indicators point to the fact that you've got the size, the number of strata that gives you something relatively consistent and is going to reduce your variance.
Right. These little pock marks on your screen on the left and the right that are in pink, they're excluded areas because of forest, and the yellow marks are the stratas. There are other holes that are cut out that are not in pink that are in yellow. Can you talk to some of the reasons you'd remove a relatively small block within a relatively big consistent block, like on that right-hand picture in the northernmost strata, there's just a little circular cutout there. What's that about? Is that a water point? Why is it? No, other right. Sorry, Christophe.
Sorry, this one there.
Next image across in the dark brown.
Oh, sorry, this one.
Yeah, that one there. How does that end up being an excluded part from a stratification?
I'm trying to remember because I was there and I'm trying to visualize what was there. It was something like a dedicated part of the field that they used to create hay or something like that. It was that one little strange area that was used for a slightly different purpose, and therefore soil must have been fertilized differently or appeared differently on the imagery. That little one is exactly for that reason. That little one there, yeah.
But you've got, say, half a dozen on both the left side and the right side image of these little cutouts. How important is that to stratification?
Look, this one is funny because I do specifically remember the one that you've singled out, but all the other ones are either artifacts or, for some reason like that, there might have been a large tree that has sucked the soil moisture. You always have those little poke marks everywhere. I don't worry too much about them usually. I'll consider them artifacts, unless there's a really good reason, like this specific one that you mentioned. They're just small artifacts, and I'm not too sure why they do that.
Okay, thank you.
But the old stratification algorithm usually throw up those little things. So unless somebody, Mel or anyone has a more technical explanation than mine, I treat them as artifacts.
Which area? Is it the little...
Oh, just all around. You've got contour-driven stratas, but on the left, and you've got a fairly uniform geography on the right. But in both images, there's half a dozen little cutouts
Little
in
ones,
the stratas.
little ones,
the
little
yellow
ones.
bits?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're like a house or a pond. So it's excluded if it's a building or like a dam.
Right. Okay. And the pinks are excluded because of the vegetation rather than the physical geomorphology sort of side of things. Okay.
It looks like ownership.
Yep. And
Yeah.
trials or fur trials, if you that farm on the right and you've been, you know, peanut farming, but 1 year you ran a biologicals trials, you'd you'd separate them when you're strataing, right? Because there's a different
Yeah.
historical treatment, so you would expect there to be variance, so you wouldn't want that.
Yeah.
CEA.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think FarmLab and CarbonLink both get spatial data, and you could just tell probably by the veg and all sorts of nutrients that one's going to be quite different from the other. So you would want to keep them separate, otherwise the variance would be massive.
Okay. Good to hear.
And it does take some time to find the right stratification, but as it was said, it's pretty important because it'll influence the results of your soil sampling. That is exactly what we just said, but in the words of the CER, they themselves that you say that you've got to minimize the changes in your the inconsistency in your strata, and the probability of exceedance discount is set at 60%. So if you don't minimize it by minimizing your variance, you're set for a 60% discount on your salt carbon estimation, which is pretty big. Hence the importance of doing that stratification really carefully. It gets mathematical pretty quickly. So usually you can do it yourself with tools like FarmLab, but best to talk to somebody, a CSP or anyone else that really knows what they're doing, because it's quite technical quickly. Right? After that, so calculating the your soil carbon content from the sampling results. You're happy, you've got your 20 samples back from the lab, and you want to calculate the soil carbon of your CEA. Now, I don't know if you remember when we were talking about full cam. I said once you've got the estimates from full cam in the Excel file, you just pop that into another Excel that does all your other abatement calculations for from those full cam results to a CER format, and that's really dead easy. It is, but not for soil carbon. For soil carbon, you don't have a choice in hell to do the soil carbon calculation yourself. They're just for fun. I've taken 2 pages out of the method, and you'll see that this is equation 115 that you have to calculate your soil carbon. So you have to use a specialized software to do your soil carbon calculation. There's no 2 ways about it. All right. You can do it yourself, but it'll take you a bit of time. And I think to be fair, equation 115 is the penultimate equation. There's only 116 all up in the method. So rest assured, it's not that complicated. So again, FarmLab, no specific. I don't have stock in FarmLab, but they provide the software for you to do that. So you give them the results, sampling results, and They send you all the calculation in the CER format, because again, in the offset report, you need to spell out step by step your calculation, and they give you all that step by step expressed exactly as the CER wants it. So pretty convenient. So frequently asked questions. I'm sorry. We've talked about how many samples per project area, how many CEAs, and how to stratify. Quite technical. All of that is based on the consistency of results and minimize, exactly as Mel was saying, striking the right balance between cost and the number of samples, and reducing that variance so that you don't get that, so that you minimize that probability of exceedance discount. Right? How much does it cost? I've put you there just literally one quote that I have from a sampler. So $120 per core, which is not too much if you think about it, but depending on where you are, because the travel and accommodation usually is the bulk of the cost, actually. I was about to say something. Can't remember. Yeah. So that's roughly how it costs. Oh yes, sorry. That also depends on how much time it takes to do a call. A good sampler can usually do 20 calls a day if the ground is not too difficult. So it goes quickly. If you have a small CEA, say 100 hectares, it's done in a day, right? So you've got say if you've got 20 samples, you've got $2,400 for the coring, and another $250 for 1 night or 2 nights accommodation, plus if the sample travels 100 kilometers, that's another $100, so for 20 samples. But if you're really remote, it'll start to add up. But that's without lab cost.
Mel's
lab cost.
Yeah. Mel Zeppel's just mentioning going to depths beyond a meter 20. What's the main driver of like if you've got a core, you know, is it cheaper to do a 30 centimeter core compared to a meter core, knowing you have to do a meter? Is the machinery that much harder to get to a meter 20? Once you're doing the lab costs, is there any time that you would do a core and not have the sample costs, the lab costs associated with it? Like, surely they're added together.
Yeah, I think it's just if you have, I think there's a sampler on the call, but CarbonLink had cores that went to 120 centimeters. So that with an extra 20 centimeters, the cost is probably minimal, but the amount of extra carbon that you get. Yeah. So Mike just said each centimeter of depth. Yeah.
Right.
So definitely, sometimes if there was rocks, they could only get down to like 90 centimeters or something like that. But I would say go as deep as you possibly because the top 30 centimeters is going to lose carbon from drought or erosion or whatever, but the deeper soil carbon is going to stay there for longer.
Brilliant. Who's the sampler, Kim? Is that Sarah Fay? Is that you?
Yeah.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
Feel free to jump in here. We'd love to hear from you.
I guess it depends on the equipment that you've got to hand, and the length of tube is probably the easiest thing. Like if you don't have to reinsert within the hole, you've got a 1.20 meter tube, then easy to just go with that if you've got the type of soil that you can go to that depth.
And where do you
jackhammer onto the jackhammer on your corer so that you can go to that depth.
Sarah, are you seeing, and I'm thinking particularly for the Southern Tablelands group here, Jeremy and Vince and co, how doable is it for a community-owned soil coring capacity? So a bunch of these guys could potentially use their funding pooled to buy a buggy and buy a corer and things like that. What's your experience on the setup of a small business around coring? Is it possible for a community-owned coring business to establish, in your view?
Possibly not the right one. I'm pretty early on the journey as such.
Right.
Yeah. So, and it depends if they want to go trailer mounted, you know, fully self-contained type of unit that they can easily share within the group, or that they're going to do handheld, you know, those units. I can't think of the term. Yeah, itself, has the jackhammer driven in that they hold as well. You can do multiple cores on site. But, so, and I guess it's, yeah, how they are in relationship and all that sort of stuff. That's got to be thought about.
Wardy, the discussion about sampling equipment, I actually had the choice with Precision Pastures of taking the trailer or the truck, and the trailer was a little bit cheaper, but the discussion was that every centimetre that you achieved in core depth had significant value, so the extra weight of the truck actually made a difference in the choice.
Yep. Excellent. And I see Gavin talking that soils on the northern rivers, 90 centimeters. So, your meter's fine, like going to an extra meter 20 when you can relatively only get to 90, I guess make it for your context. Sorry, Christophe, I've broken your flow.
Not at all, not at all. I do agree with Mel and Mike that it's worth going for the extra depth if you can. Once you've got a sampler on site, might as well go for it. The difference in cost is not going to be that much greater, and you'll have more stable solid carbon estimates by going deeper. So that'd be my advice. I've never seen a project that not sampling at 100 centimeters. So, right. Other questions? How often do you sample? Well, the minimum is 1 year. In the method, you can't sample more than once a year. The maximum is 5 years. Or 10 years if you use the model assisted method between physical sampling rounds. But if you're doing some physical sampling rounds every time, the maximum is 5 years, right? Check that your sampler actually knows the CER requirements, because as I said, you need to have that chain of custody. You need to have the sampler fill a form that to declare that they don't have any financial interest. They must respect exactly the protocol in terms of if they hit an obstacle, etc. They need to take the pictures to be able to make sure that the sampling process has been auditable, etc., etc. So basically, pick a sampler that's done CER sampling before. It's not that well, it's a bit complicated. That's it. That's it. We're actually done. That's the next section. Oh,
Brilliant. I think plenty of FAQs. If you want to stop sharing for now, and we'll open to the floor. Some people might be interested in their specific regions, who to approach, how to approach, etc. And we can start to try and cover those things.
Or if you want to talk about the requirement of the soil carbon method itself, what are the restrictions, what are the permitted activities, what can you do, what can you not do? In the Monday session, I think there was a question about biochar, for example. Anyway, what you want to know about soil carbon.
How about the eligible activities, Christophe? I feel like we didn't spend a lot of time there. There's people who've been time controlled grazing for several years, and so might be looking for eligible activities outside of that. So what have you seen as experiences of good eligible activities?
Controlled grazing is well, eligible activities. The requirement is to actually your commitment in your LMS is to do one eligible activity, at least one, and to maintain one ongoing for the duration of the project. You don't have to commit to do more than one. So you can do as many as you want. You can do whatever you want on your land, as long as it's not a restricted activity to improve your soil carbon. You just have to have one nominated activity. The reason I'm saying that is a lot of people say, I'm going to do controlled grazing or rotational grazing because it's an easy one to do or to commit to doing, because then you don't have to prove anything. You just have to prove that you do rotational grazing, but you can do many other activities. So there's a difference between what you actually do and your nominated eligible activity, right? The nominated eligible activities are basically rotational grazing, fertilizing, remediating the soil, moving from tillage to no tillage, retaining the stubble after cropping, remediating the soil with lime or gypsum. I can't remember, restructuring the soil, for example, clay delving or things like that. I didn't mention fertilizing, and that's basically, so it covers a pretty large spectrum. Oh, sorry, I forgot two very important ones. Rejuvenating pasture, if you're using pasture, and planting legumes, which are actually the easiest and probably cheapest one to do if you're running a pasture and your pasture is already degraded. Putting legumes or improving your pasture is probably a very good idea. Now, another thing to remember is that if you're running a farm, the benefits of you doing all the activities are in terms of your production benefits are probably way higher than the benefit that you're going to get in soil carbon. So you're doing it to improve your soil carbon, but the benefit of doing your soil carbon is not so much the credits, is the improvement in your soil, which is going to benefit your productivity. So from the farming perspective, soil carbon is a side benefit, not really the main game. The main game is to improve your soil, right? Yeah. So if you're a livestock farmer, rotational grazing, improving your pastures, and planting legumes are the two most obvious ones. That's the three most obvious ones to do.
There's some great conversation in the chat. Paris, your experience with equipment and the actual chain of custody protocol being more difficult than the sampling. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to add, like, I think buying, sorry, I've got a dog going feral. All the equipment is pretty easy, but it was more, we like had a mini audit and were surprised, like, if you come to a tree root and need to move your sampling point, for example, like you have to really be on top of providing the data and the evidence for every decision you make in the field. And it's definitely like even most GPSs that you'll take out might not have the correct location accuracy needed for it to be passed. So it's like all the technical stuff hidden in the documents, which is what is the troubling thing. So you could probably like co-buy all the equipment, but you might need to get in a qualified sampler just to make sure, because you don't want to have to do it again essentially with the cost. Yeah.
True. Thank you. Mel, Zeppel, please share any questions or pearls of wisdom.
Yeah, I agree with what Paris said in that it seemed like the audit and the paperwork and the all the things that Christophe was talking about yesterday, like who is the land rights and the bank, like all those pieces of paper and audit. I think I would just pay someone to do it, because it was just so onerous, and unless either you're very bored or you like banging your head against a brick wall, I would just pay someone to take care of all that, because there's lots of little teeny and tiny rules as well. Like by the time you sample the cores, they have to be at this place within 60 days, and if it's not, then just so many little rules. But also there's, I think, Climate Friendly is pretty good, and Carbon Link and Precision Pastures. A lot of them, people will say, oh, here's my farm, it's in this area, it's in this rainfall, this is the land use, this is what I've done. And those people will be able to say, yes, you'd have a great soil carbon project, or no, you wouldn't. And you can maybe assume that they might be a bit biased, that they want you to. But also if they say no, I think Terry used to say, oh, you've got too many trees, too close together, it's going to be really hard to get in there. Or sometimes it's too small, or your rainfall is too low. Or also some landowners had been doing really good regen ag for such a long time that the soil carbon was saturated. So their baseline was so high, which totally sucks if you've been doing the right thing and can't earn accus for it. But the best properties are starting from a low point, doing really good changes in additionality. So those kind of people, if you just give them a shape file of where your land is, they can have a look and say, yeah, that would make a great project or not.
That is actually a good point, which is before registration, is how do you decide whether you have a worthwhile soil carbon project? And it's not about whether you have a great soil or not, because as you're saying, Mel, if you already have a great soil, there's no point doing a soil carbon project, because you're not going to gain anything. So the trick is to start from a low base and have a high potential. But if you have a property that doesn't have a great potential, but you're starting from a very, very low base, is very degraded, then you have a worthy soil carbon project. What matters is the difference between where you are and where you can go. The way I used to do that, apart from what you're saying, a really good quick estimate is if you use Look-See. Look-See for soil carbon gives you a chart like that of, in your region, the average soil carbon content, and where you are on that curve. So it's quite easy. It's not 200% accurate, but it's quite easy to see actually. If you are very low in the bell curve, then your specific location has a lot of potential to move. If you're very high in the bell curve and you believe Look-See, then it's probably not a lot potential for you to do. But it's a great thing to do before you embark in a soil carbon project, yes. Because if you maximize your soil, there's no point doing one. A lot of people usually, when they're faced with that decision, say, "Oh, it's unfair because etc." And my answer is, well, it's unfair, but think of all the years where you benefited from an amazing production in your farm because your soil is excellent. So good on you, well done. You don't need the soil carbon because it's a sideshow really compared to the benefits of production. So, very good point. Know beforehand where you stand on that curve and what's your augmentation potential.
Mike.
40. This discussion around sort of whether the soil carbon project is good or not, I think comes back to more than just the one new nominated practice. So the example of holistic grazing is there, but if you've already been using it, you can't use it as the new practice. So, you have to remember for a start off that you've got to have a new practice to nominate. And then our advice was, from my own personal experience, you really need to stack up the practices. It's not just about, say, grazing. It might be about grazing and mineralized compost, or it might be about a multi-species pasture in there as well. And in fact, to be successful in the soil carbon, you probably need to stack all of these processes together to give yourself the greatest concentration of carbon going into the soil. But even by stacking them together, you only nominate one practice to the to the CER. So that seems to be the trick. Nominate the one that you're going to report on for the life of the project, but you do everything in your power to get carbon in that soil.
Why can't you nominate more than one?
If you nominate more than one, you actually have to report on more than one. So you just nominate the one that you want to report on, and you do the others anyway.
And nominate the one that you want to report on. That is the easiest to report on as well. Because, for example, if you nominate, I don't know, irrigation as your activity, then you have to make sure that you give the regulator the baseline for the 5 year before application of the irrigation that you did, to prove that you're not actually doing more than 20% irrigation. So if you nominate more than one activity, you'll have all the burden of reporting and proof, etc., etc. I'm with Mike. Nominate one. Do as much as you can, but nominate only one. Commit to only one. I hope there's nobody from the CR on that call.
We're only recording.
But yeah. That's right. But they're right. Yeah.
Great questions. Any other questions? The Southern Tablelands guys, Kath, Jeremy, Colette, Vince, any of that concern around full carbon saturation coming up for you guys? I know that Vince, you've spent ages working on your soil. Do you feel you're close to saturation, or worth looking at where you are?
Nothing I've read or heard suggests that these soils get saturated or are anywhere near carbon levels that we can achieve. But again, a lot of these are fairly thin soils, with light duplex soils in some places, but in others, they're these bloody basalt soils with so many rocks. I just don't know how that goes with this sampling. I do wonder. It seems to me like there's an opportunity there to do something, but I wonder. There's a question there, or sorry, a statement there before. You've got to be doing at least 500 hectares. Are we talking about per CEA, or are we talking about per farm, or what was that reference to, the 500 hectare threshold?
That was the entire project, but that was what Carbon Link's viewpoint was. But you might want to just do it by yourself, because in terms of the cost of going out and mobilizing and sampling and auditing and blah, 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 I think, so Carbon Link will take 18% of your accus for the joy of handling all your paperwork. So you could maybe do it yourself. But the thing is, you get accus per hectare. So the more hectares, sorry, what do you think, Christophe?
No. Go ahead. I was excited because it's a really good question.
So there was a project in the Northern Territory, and they had something like, I don't know, like 50,000 hectares or 1 million hectares or something. So if they just get like 0.1 of a ton of carbon, but spread across an enormous number of hectares, they can still make very, very large profit. But if you have only 500 hectares, you would I don't know, you'd have to get a really high increase in carbon, because there's an upfront cost of, I don't know what registering is, but auditing has got a cost. And what do you think?
Registering is free. My rule of thumb is, don't attempt to do soil carbon on your own below 100 hectares. If you do the math, given the fixed cost that Mel was talking about, especially, but mostly auditing and sampling, you'd have to have an enormous increase. You can easily back calculate it, you'd have to have an enormous increase in your soil carbon, which is unrealistic, to actually make money. You may, but you're taking a huge risk, because once you sign up for the project, you are in for audit cost and sampling cost, and that's fixed. And if your soil carbon actually doesn't improve, it's a net loss for you. There's one way out of that, is to use a carbon link or an agri-proof, which is, yes, they suck up 80% or 25%, but in the case of agri-proof, they take all the financial risk. So you may not get much, but you're not going to lose anything, right? So that's one way out of that conundrum. But if you don't have 100 hectares of soil carbon, unless you know that you're starting from a dead, you know, you're buying a desert. If you don't have 100 hectares, be really, really, really careful about it. It's easy to calculate. It's easy to back calculate and say, this is my place. You know, this is what I know. What do I have to believe the increase in soil carbon to be to not lose money? It's easy to calculate. There was a suggestion in the chat, which I agree with. If you're facing that uncertainty, do a sample, a couple of sampling runs, right? Not necessarily the full thing, and not necessarily to 1 meter. You can do a manual or an agricultural type sample to give you an idea where you stand. Use Luxi, but back that up with an easy run of, you know, agricultural $200 type or $100 type sampling to actually know where you really sit. But be careful with soil carbon, because you can lose money quite easily. So do the math before. Absolutely agree. Mike, you wanted to say something?
How much is the cost of audit, Christophe? Is it? I heard about 30,000. Is that right?
No, it's not 30,000, but close. I've had quotes between 17 and 53,000. So be careful who you choose. But yeah, it's pretty expensive, and you have a minimum of 3. So even if you find, you know, the most cost-effective auditor, you're in for, you know, 60 grand of audits. Plus, if you have a 6 grand round of sampling every 5 years, that's another 30 grand. So a soil carbon project will cost you most probably close to 100 grand. So we're talking real money here. Sorry, Mike.
But the first 5 that got through got something like $500,000 each.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Like the Bonnie Doon and those projects.
But they are 9,000 hectares, I think. So,
that's also true.
Yeah.
Oh, but I was going to say, if you've got like 100 hectares or 500, you could find a neighbor and see if you could do an aggregated project. Don't you reckon?
True. RFM is quickly specializing in aggregated project. There was a good question from someone on the chat. I think it was from Marcos, that says, what would happen if your nominated practice does not yield the expected result? Can you change or nominate a new practice after the initial audit? Yes, you can. You have to redo your LMS, but yes, you can change your nominated practice.
And I think it's good advice on different practices and their suitability for your location. Because some of those practices on that list, you know, aren't actually necessarily good change of practice from my perspective as a long-term consultant. So yeah, do make sure you get good advice as whether what change of practice would be suitable for your context and your location.
Look, I think that's wise. Yeah. Can I just go back to what you were saying, Christophe, if that's at all possible? You were saying 100 grand cost for a project. You know, we were talking 60 grand's worth of audit and then ongoing testing. And so you were saying, well, it's a lot of money. So, so if is this what you're saying? It's going to cost for a decade or for 5 years or just up front? Or what do you, what's that number relate to?
over the life of the project.
Over the life of the project.
Yeah. We're starting on tomorrow's discussion, but yeah, that was over the life of the project. And that's
because it would seem that if at $30 an accu, that's 3,000 accus. So if you've got 1,000 hectares or something, you're talking about 3 accus in a decade. It doesn't seem like a shitload of carbon to be putting away to cover the cost, just to cover the cost.
Yeah, but if you have 1,000
you've got to have the money up front. I understand.
Yeah, exactly. And you're taking the risk that it actually doesn't even trade. If you're doing it with a forest project, for example, where you have very high certainty of return, yeah, definitely. But if you're talking 1,000 hectares, completely different ballgame. I'm talking about people who are thinking about entering it with 100 hectares, 200 hectares. That's the danger zone. If you have 1,000 hectares, you'll pretty much you can go ahead and do it yourself.
So
right.
Maybe this is a question for Wardy and just a sort of a Dorothy Dixer, but aren't we looking at trying to get people who've got 50 hectares, 100 hectares, 200 hectares to come together as a conglomerate or a co-op, for want of a better word, and do a project together?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And it's easier, and try not to conflate plantings, which don't need anywhere near the same number of hectares to be aggregated. So 50 hectares in an environmental plantings can stand up pretty easily, whereas 50 hectares of a soil carbon probably wouldn't cover the admin costs of each person. We don't know the thresholds of at what point minimum size do you need to be in a soil carbon project before that makes economic sense. We're still happy to stand behind self-proponents and be a proponent for things that are, provable economically. The aggregation soil carbon project has an additional complexity. We'll talk about it tomorrow, which is it's usually tied to the person's core business, right? This is their most productive land. So getting farmers who want to be jointly and severally liable in a carbon project over 25 years, depending on their age and their stage, with their neighbours is another problem with aggregated soil carbon projects, because it's not on non-productive land that you're putting under biodiversity or adding trees to an environment. It's legumes and grazing management and pasture improvement and fertilizer use that everybody's sort of agreeing to for 25 years from the beginning of the project. So there's challenges on soil carbon and aggregating it that aren't there on plantings.
Yeah.
Very true. And again, sorry, go, Mike.
I was just going to back that up. I think the soil carbon process does have excellent power to generate some accus, but it is on your core business. So it's across your grazing land, it's across your farming land. It's not around the edge of it. It's not an area that was a bit rougher that you can lock up for biodiversity. It's in your core productive country. We actually ended up with 3 different carbon estimation areas on 1,000 hectares. We had 3 different areas because they were 3 different prime or core enterprises. So our core management on those areas was different from area to area. Now, that does enable you can actually nominate a different practice for each different carbon estimation area. So that actually gave me a little bit of flexibility, because on our grazing country, we'd been using holistic management for 20 years already. We couldn't use it. So we had to find a different change of practice on that enterprise to get that land able to be included. We're not stopping the holistic management, because that's those stacked enterprises. We're still doing everything we can to push the carbon in, but we've just had, we had to find one that we could nominate that we hadn't been doing previously. So I'd concur with Christophe. 3 carbon estimation areas across 1,000 hectares. I think the smallest one was about 300 hectares. I certainly wouldn't go under that. I'd be going, maybe 500 hectares as a minimum before it's worth all of the paperwork and the complexity. But Christophe's is probably more accurate. If you had one enterprise type and one CEA, you could get it down to 100 hectares maybe.
But it's getting to a point where you can have a great carbon project on 50 hectares, but it's getting to managing your risk really carefully. I'd be the lower you go, the more careful you have to be, because the more likely you are to lose money. Above 1,000 hectares, you're pretty safe. When you get towards 100, you got to do your maths really carefully and know what you're stepping into. Right? Question of risk management. Cool, good discussion.
All right.
If you had a question in the chat and we haven't responded to it, please note it down and send it by email or something that we can actually address it.
So just to finish up today, tomorrow is the economics. Now we've gone through, I think, the hard parts of the boring parts of what's the method and how do you get registered on the portal and using full cam and stratification. Tomorrow we get to talk about the goodies. What's all this worth and how does it work economically? So please tune in tomorrow. I will put the recording from tonight back up on the Miro and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible tomorrow.
All righty. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.